I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Amy Fong is a Vice President in Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in outsourced services categories. Rita Soni is Everest Group's Principal Analyst for Impact Sourcing and Sustainability. Her focus delivers a triple bottom line lens of people, planet, and profits to global services market research, beginning with an in-depth explanation into impact sourcing. Manushi Malhotra, Practice Director, works with sourcing and vendor management leaders on collaboration research and advisory engagements to help them extract the maximum value from their procurement activities. And after all that, I would now like to turn things over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you, Dave. All right, understanding ESG, it is an interesting topic. Certainly lots of attention being played on it right now. It's a topic that has its own vocabulary, lots of acronyms. So I'm constantly asking the question of what does that mean again? We see it as an evolving topic. And so one of the first things we'll do with Rita here is to showcase how it's evolved. It's also got a lot of relevancy today as we see how it impacts relationships between companies and their clients, and also between companies and their talent pool. So whether that's either the new prospects or new recruits, if you will, or the existing employee base. So with that, let's go ahead and get right into it, Rita, and let's start talking about how the definitions evolved here. And what we've done here is created kind of not necessarily a timeline, but an evolution in the definition, starting out with the green, and then we've kind of shown how it's evolved with a light blue and then darker blue, and then over into the purpose-driven aspect of it with some of the orangey colors there. Go ahead and explain what you're trying to do here, Rita, and give us some context.
Thanks a lot, Michael. So I think the word evolution is great in this context. We know that there's a lot of terminology out there, and the concept of ESG continues to evolve. We thought that this was a really important way to start thinking about it, beginning with the idea that much of the start of a lot of companies' journeys was in the area of philanthropy and a license to operate, feel-good kind of activities, and a lot of social responsibility. As the concepts moved, we got to the concept of triple bottom line. John Elkington created the term. People started to think more about mitigating risks and mitigating negative effects on people and planet, and really thinking a lot more about risk mitigation. In 3.0, the concept of responsible business is where there's really a sense that there's opportunity around the ESG concept. Companies are starting to make money doing this work. There's a lot more focus on sustainability enablement. And 4.0 in many ways is really the pinnacle. It's where the purpose of business is not shareholder maximization, but stakeholder engagement and the entire ecosystem being involved. Interestingly, one of the factoids that we didn't put on the slide was that when we did a quick poll about this, we did hear 94% of respondents believe CSR has a positive impact on their business. So we know that these are important conversations to have, and we see this evolving. Therefore, I came on board very recently also to talk about this topic. So, and I think the audience size is also a representative of how important this topic is. So with this evolution, we actually created our own framework. If we can go to the next slide, calling it a purpose framework. And the idea is that the purpose framework, Michael likes to remind me that this industry really began with thinking about saving money and productivity. But as time has evolved and a purpose framework has been put into the context, we thought we'd create this common ground. So this framework really combines the concept of triple bottom line and ESG, which is environment, social, and governance. And what we've also added is that there's a business case alongside profits, and alongside governance, there's monitoring and reporting and evaluation. I think what's interesting for us in this industry as we talk about services, my bias is to think really about the social side of things. We are a people-driven industry. And as I mentioned earlier, we're already seeing companies like those that are on our call today, enterprises creating products and services that promote and mitigate environmental and social impact. So what we're also seeing is that providers are very interested in coming up with solutions that are going to demonstrate their contributions to people and planet. Fact of the matter is we can't do it alone. And I think that the environmental issues are important, relatively easy to identify, benchmark, and assess. Societal benefits, again, my interest area is where we're really thinking about how we're going to identify where the potential impact is both positive and negative. And with that, I think we can start getting into the poll and asking some questions of our audience and engaging them.
Yeah, so let's do just that. Let's open up the poll here, and what we're going to do is ask you about your organization, your perceptions of what your organization is doing. So what are the key drivers of introducing ESG initiatives into your organization? And this is a multiple choice poll, so go ahead and feel free to select more if it's relevant, more than one if it's relevant. And we'll leave it open for just a few minutes, or just a few seconds, actually. So Rita, I'm seeing the results come in here, and as people jump in here, this is there's no clear winner here. This is a horse race. All right, we'll leave it up.
That's why it's select all that apply, right?
Yeah, there's only one answer that's kind of lagging behind, which I think is a good one. So, all right, let's close it out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and all right, let's showcase the results here. All right, so you guys can see the numbers just as we're seeing them here. I guess let's point to the one that didn't get a lot of choices. I think that's progress here. As organizations not introduced any ESG initiatives, only roughly 10% of the audience had that response here. But if you look at the rest of them, and the answers, it's all over the board here. Lots of different things happening.
Yeah, it's also interesting that the second smallest answer is about cost optimization, which is sort of the origins of much of this sector. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're watching some of the talent and cost. The whole issue of cost takeout is going to be it's going to be more about the talent aspect of it, and I think that's where some of this, what we're going to be talking about today, comes into play as well.
Great.
All right, so let's Rita, why don't you go ahead and talk about the shifting focus here.
So diving more deeply into those options that we just voted on, we want to say, yes, investor preference is definitely a key driver towards ESG. The Global Sustainable Investment Alliance estimates that in 2020, there was over $35 trillion in assets, or a third of global assets that were going into sustainable investment. So investors are definitely engaged. 85% of investors are considering ESG, even if they're not targeting a specific ESG fund when they're assessing investments. So we know that the investors are there, and they're giving a lot of pressure to the board of directors. Regulations and global guidance has always been a concern and been part of the conversation, but we're finding that there's a lot more behind that, and a lot more consolidation that's happening. This is more like we're kind of going full circle on the concept of this being about risk mitigation and compliance, because in places like Europe, where the regulations are really going full force, I think we're seeing a lot more activity. Demographic changes and increased employee sentiment is another important key driver. We're thinking about the millennials and Gen Z, and their response to things like the pandemic and a lot of the global social unrest that's happened since that time. So in these last few years. And I think that's also related to the changing customer sentiments, which we saw as the highest poll category. It's similar to these younger people, but it's also about brands going beyond and looking at the opportunities, maybe sometimes being a little opportunistic or opportunism there, but there's a lot of conversation around ESG topics in brand. But at the end of the day, there is still a need for cost optimization and value creation in this sector. That's what we do, whether it's with technology or through processes. So we do see that still continues to be a key driver.
Okay, Rita, in our registration process, we had a number of questions that related to, do good ESG benchmarks exist and where can I find them? That was one of the questions, but there were several that were related to that. How do you view the benchmark question in this sector?
So I think I think what's happened in literally the last year and a half in the middle of the pandemic is consolidation of a lot of entities. In June 2001, the SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounts Standards Board, sorry, so many acronyms, and the International Integrated Reporting Council, they consolidated and became Value Reporting Foundation with the idea that we want to create value from doing this work and it's not just about a reporting mechanism. And then very recently, the International Financial Reporting Standards, which I think everybody on the call will know about, has created the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that's in collaboration with the Value Reporting Foundation. They're working with the World Economic Forum, the Global Reporting Initiative. Oh my God, so many acronyms. But the fact is that there's a lot of consolidation. So that reporting can not just get standardized, but then can also get compared across time, across organizations. And I think that's kind of where all of that is going.
Rita, I think you have a cheat sheet on acronyms here. If anybody needs that cheat sheet, they can reach out to you directly.
Absolutely. And now I think it would be great to get into the procurement view of things after going very general. Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Rita. That's a great lead in to what's really going on in the broader market and across most of our organizations. And it looks like, 90% of the people on here are in some way looking at ESG initiatives. And most of you, hopefully from the supply standpoint as well. It's really interesting. I think procurement is in a very unique position to make a really large impact on sustainability and ESG initiatives just by our position in working with the supply base. And this is not new to most procurement organizations. They've been working on diversity. They've been working on green supply chain for a long time. What we really see is procurement at the point in between all of the internal towers in the business, the finance, legal, risk, operations, various business units, and the external ecosystem of suppliers and third parties, that the whole network. And procurement has the opportunity to bring those sustainability objectives into that ecosystem. So, we're going to talk a little bit more today about how that works and specifically in the services space versus the goods supply chain, where we're a little bit, further behind on that, I would say.
All right, sounds good. Let's move into the next where we talk about move beyond the definitions and we get into how the ESG is being seen in the services sourcing segment here. So we're going to open up another quick poll here. And the question is, which of the following categories is your organization applying ESG objectives? So where are you looking for your outside service providers to be held accountable for? So again, quick polls open here. This is another multiple choice type question. So there is no, just pick one. All right, again, lots of horse race, but we got a lot of horses in this one, Amy.
Well, this is as long a list of spend categories as we could get. So this probably looks familiar to most people. These are all the things you buy.
All right, we'll leave it
Not
open.
even all. Right?
Yeah, no, it's just kind of the services aspect of this, but let's leave it open for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, good, great participation. Appreciate that. All right, Amy here. Business process and IT services at the top of the list that they're looking to apply these measures to.
Yeah, so interesting. I am not surprised to see this. I think this aligns with a lot of what we've seen. I think the key here is probably that we're around about 50% for many of the, for most of these categories on average, right? And I think that validates kind of the hypothesis I've had that, we've been working on a lot of initiatives, but we've started, for instance, with, green environmental sustainability tends to be focused on the supply chain historically. When we look at, diverse suppliers tends to be focused on, some of the categories outside of services where it might be a little easier to find those suppliers. So this kind of backs that up. Contingent workforce, I'm a little surprised to see that so low, actually.
Yeah, Amy, I looked at that one. I was gonna make the same comment there with talent shortages and talent on just about every conversation we have. To see that one kind of at the bottom of the list was a little bit interesting.
Yeah, and traditionally staffing agencies have actually been a pretty good segment to find diverse suppliers in. So, but maybe not necessarily the MSPs. So it kind of depends on what your model looks like there.
Yeah.
We can jump to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this, which is kind of a category view. Looking across these categories, again, where we've seen a really high percentage of diverse spend, for instance, is in things like IT software and hardware and temp labor. In marketing, logistics, maybe you can find some suppliers that meet, from a logistics perspective, probably looking at green supply chain. Again, that's a I want to say low-hanging fruit. That's really where you need to start if you're looking at zero emissions, right? Or net zero carbon. When we get to certain categories like travel and outsourced services, it's been historically more difficult. If you're managing travel spend, you probably know that most of your spend is going to providers like United and American Airlines or, Delta, depending on where your headquarters is. That's where a huge percent of your spend is. Other than your travel agency, which is likely to be a big provider, your options there are lower, and that's the same case with outsourced services. So when we look at the categories for the outsourced services that we cover, you have a small number of providers with high spend per provider, and our data shows it's usually about 350 to 400 million per provider at the starting point for outsourced services. You've got a narrow supply base, not a lot of choices. We see most spend across the top 25 outsourced providers, and then high switching costs to your stakeholders. And it's the same for travel, right? If you don't want to switch from United to American with no warning, or Marriott to IHG because you've got a lot of loyalty and benefits to consistency. Same thing, you're not going to tell your IT stakeholders, hey, we're going to change all of our outsourcing right away. Or your BPO provider is probably concentrated with one supplier or service provider, and there's a lot of economies of scale there, and so the economies of scale as well as the entry costs from the provider side make it really challenging for diverse providers to enter the market. So when you're looking at supplier diversity, it's pretty difficult to find outsourced service provider that meets all of the business needs and fits into your portfolio strategy, and is also going to count in the traditional definition of diverse spend. So it's really, it's difficult. It's really an opportunity to think differently about this, I think, and come up with some creative solutions. And that's kind of the meat of what we wanted to talk about today. Some of the ways that you can be thinking about this too, I've very often, and I've spent a lot of time in the last 12 to 15 years with organizations, diversity, supplier diversity leaders in big companies, and they go, well, here's all the spend that we can work on, and here's all the spend we can't touch. And a lot of services spend ends up in that we can't touch it, we can't really do much with it. And we need to think bigger than that. I think that's where we need to go in this decade, is thinking about how we insert ESG objectives into all of our spend. And so we really wanted to talk a bit about that today.
Yeah.
In terms of, Venushi, I will hand it to you to look at some of the use cases that we've seen. And I know you've seen quite a few of these in your experience working with various companies and where they're inserting ESG into that process.
Yeah, definitely. So we've actually been talking to a lot of, the supply side as well as the enterprise side. And we've figured that sourcing, when they're looking at the supply base, the main objective is to track the ESG footprint of their suppliers across the life cycle of procurement. So you go through category management, and then you enter supplier relationship management. And across this entire life cycle, you want to look at all of the ESG objectives that we've been talking about. So one thing, that we should consider when we start from the first phase, which is supplier selection, designing your category strategies, is that you need to sort of bring in a mindset change when it comes to looking at ESG objectives, because when you traditionally look at outsourced services categories, you need to think that, okay, we cannot just select the suppliers that we've been working with for the past couple of years, but we need to consider these ESG related criteria. For instance, supplier diversity is something that Amy mentioned, suppliers workforce diversity is something we'll get into. So these are the criteria that we increasingly need to look at, and we increasingly need to consider more specialist suppliers that are actually doing better off in these ESG activities. Similarly, when we move into the next phase, supplier selection, and then we move into the ongoing supplier relationship management process, we need to think about how we can track ESG metrics on a regular basis, whether it comes to, say, energy efficiencies that the supplier is managing, whether it comes to the net zero targets that they're actually driving, or the dates that they're trying to achieve when they're looking at their net zero initiatives. So these are the things that we can track on an ongoing basis. And a lot of it, of course, depends on your organizational goals as well, right? Like, is net zero important for you? Is supplier diversity important for you? These are the things that you need to consider when you're evaluating your supply base. So ongoing management is a very, very key aspect. And one of the key enabler, I would say, is digital and data management to actually ensure that you are able to manage for tracking of ESG metrics on an ongoing basis. So this is not only on an enterprise level, right? Even for your suppliers, we can see how well your service providers are actually tracking their own ESG metrics. For instance, we've heard of, some providers that are using AI and ML based solutions to actually track their energy efficiencies and measure their own energy consumption so that they can give you the right metrics and self-report the right metrics so that you're able to track ESG metrics on an ongoing basis. So these are, some use cases that we've seen across the sourcing lifecycle, and they're typically focused on the supply base as to what are your service providers doing and how you can manage them on an ongoing basis. When we move to the next slide, I think I call these next couple of slides a reality check. This is, what is actually happening in the market right now. When we look at service provider selection, we're talking a lot about how you should track ESG metrics. But at the current stage, if you just look at the data that we've received, Everest Group has been doing a lot of surveys around this, trying to figure out how sourcing leaders are measuring ESG across their supplier lifecycle management process. And when we looked at the data, we found that a lot of firms are still not currently taking action when it comes to service provider selection. They're not measuring ESG metrics when it comes to the supplier selection as well as management process. So if you look at the top two, which is responsible labor practices, human rights, as well as supplier diversity, these are still areas that organizations are assessing. Approximately 2/3 of organizations were assessing these two particular categories when we looked at the data. But when you look at other, more important aspects as well, such as accessibility and inclusion, which is the last one over here, not many firms are currently taking action, which means not many firms are assessing accessibility and inclusion when it comes to their supplier selection process, which is not, I would say it's not a very positive point, because, looking at services categories in general, Rita pointed out that these are very talent-centric and people-centric categories, and inclusion is a very important criteria when you look at talent as a whole, right? Your entire talent value proposition is driven around inclusion as well. So a very interesting data to see that, many firms are still not currently taking action in this regard. So this was about, how many companies are actually assessing ESG criteria. We also looked at how these companies are assessing ESG criteria. So this slide really talks about, basically the extent of adoption of approaches that enterprises are taking to address ESG requirements with suppliers. So what we saw, again, interesting data here, right? So ethical labor practices are right on top. These are being addressed. Contractor and supplier safety processes, these are again being addressed. But some of the newer tactics, such as impact sourcing, these are not broadly used even at this stage. So impact sourcing is in fact an area that we're really deep diving into. What it means is that basically what it means is that suppliers who are hiring from underrepresented communities, who are basically going into more underdeveloped areas and training resources there, these are the suppliers that are conducting impact sourcing initiatives. Rita is actually doing an RFI for impact sourcing specialists. It's something that she's collected a lot of information across suppliers. Very interesting insights in that study have come out.
That's right, Banushi. I think we are going to cover it in a couple of slides, but excited about that work and still collecting data. So anyone who would like to be involved in that or participate in that study, please do reach out.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So we wanted to give you a broad view of, we've been talking a lot about what are the things you should assess your supply base, and you should track ESG metrics on an ongoing basis. But we wanted to give a broad view of all the factors that you can consider when you are looking at your supply base across the supply management lifecycle. So this gives a view of all the ESG related parameters that you can assess maybe in your supplier selection or your supplier management process. And we already spoke a little bit about environmental aspects. So you have carbon footprint, you have net zero targets, you have social aspects such as impact sourcing, diversity. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the governance aspect here, right? So supplier governance and risk management is something that we increasingly do within the supplier management office as well. And this is something that it needs to be complied to when it comes to industry standards as well. So you need to look out for those supplier certifications that are in place that are so that you comply with the industry standards when it comes to your third-party supply base. And same story with data privacy and ESG audit related frameworks as well, right? Does your supplier have an ESG audit framework in place? Do they have ESG policies in place? Do they have an organization that manages this? Do they have that in place? So these are all the things that you need to look at when you're looking at your supply base. With that, I'll hand it over to Michael. We have a special offer for the attendees of this webinar.
Yeah, so one of the things we'd like to do is make an offer to those that are buyers of services. So if you're an enterprise and you're looking to get more in supplier intelligence on sustainability priorities with the vendor community, we're going to give you an opportunity to click on the quick poll that's just opened up on your screen. And if you select one of those, it's an opportunity to talk to Rita, Banushi, and Amy with regards to what we're seeing on key suppliers. So around sustainability offerings, their delivery capabilities, tools and IP, and client satisfaction. All right, I'll just leave that open for another 3 seconds here. 3, 2, 1. All right, and if there's any other ways we can help you, feel free to reach out to us as well, either by email or LinkedIn, either way. All right, so we're going to move into the next section here. And Amy, you're going to be the kick us off here on what sourcing teams can do.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I think an important thing here, and going back to some of the points Manish made about the parts of the sourcing process or the source to pay process end to end, that really we need to be focusing on, or kind of, listed here, but also need to be digitally enabled. So the more that you can manage information and you have good enriched information about suppliers across the supply chain, across the value chain, the more successful you're going to be in this. It starts with supplier discovery and then goes through the category management process and strategic sourcing, knowing who you can add to your portfolio, increasing the spend with those suppliers, paying them on time and treating them well, becoming the customer of choice is really important. Thinking about adding specialty suppliers as well, and then tracking things like carbon footprints of your major IT suppliers, for instance, and putting some targets in place for them, whether it's carbon related, diversity related, it may be related to their workforce diversity instead of the traditional ownership diversity metrics. And then on the longer term, managing ESG within the supplier relationship management process. So thinking about how you can embed sustainability into your SLAs, thinking about how you benchmark their key metrics, the supplier's key metrics against their peers, holding them accountable for ethical practices. That's really important as well these days. There's a lot happening out there around modern slavery and even in the services, just, workforce empowerment and treating your workforce well, and working conditions that we can hold people accountable for, as well as benchmarking performance in key metrics, and having some targets like, best in class contractual clauses and audits on a regular basis, so that you're continuously watching this. That metric Manushi showed earlier really kind of showed that we're looking at this up front, but we're not necessarily looking at it on an ongoing basis. And to really embed these practices, we don't need to switch suppliers to a more, ESG focused provider. We need to partner with our existing providers to drive these ESG objectives into our business on a longer term basis, not just at the time of selection. That's really how we're going to get to a longer term model. And I think another thing is to start with what your organizational objectives are and assess what you're trying to do with the business, and then think about how that translates into targets for your supply base. So if your business objective or your corporate headquarters is trying to support economic development in local communities, then impact sourcing or diverse supplier, increasing a diverse supply base is a really important lever to be using. And that's actually one of the, objectives of supplier diversity. It's not just, there's a lot of, bringing in different faces, right? Different perspectives, but also smaller businesses that might impact the local community. And helping to develop those local businesses or those smaller businesses. Looking at talent attrition, if that's a challenge that you're working with, thinking about how can we use impact sourcing suppliers where we've seen lower attrition rates historically. Rita's going to talk about impact sourcing as well, but how do we bring those kind of suppliers into the supply base in a new way to tap into new talent pools that may offer value that we're not currently using or accessing. Thinking about diverse and inclusive culture. I think almost every company, given the talent attrition and the great resignation and the attrition challenges and the talent wars right now, are looking at their culture. How do we increase our spend with suppliers that have a strong DEI focus in their workforce? That is not a traditional measure that procurement looked at, but it's an incredibly important measure. And there's new ways that we can look at that. There's more reporting on that available than ever. And putting that out there as an objective and something that's important to you as a buyer can help to push those initiatives more strongly at your suppliers. Suppliers are going to do what customers ask for. So we really think that, procurement driving this and pushing this with their suppliers is the way commercially to change the world, right? That is what is going to drive to drive these initiatives forward. And the same with net zero. If your services suppliers have committed to net zero targets and you're committing to net zero targets and are engaged in initiatives to achieve them, that has the potential to drive value for both and to accelerate the transition there. Rita, so talk to us a little bit about impact sourcing. And I'm going to start by saying, I think that phrase impact sourcing, I was in procurement for a long time, sourcing, did sustainability stuff, and didn't really know that phrase until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So if you could start with what is it and why is it something we should all know a lot about?
Thank you, Amy. I think it's funny. I think that's what happens when development agencies create the terms instead of procurement folks. So impact sourcing, as Banashi described a little earlier, is exactly what she described. It's intentionally hiring from excluded communities, particularly in the services sector. And as you can see, and as we've talked about earlier in the presentation, there are a multitude of benefits to impact sourcing, from a stable and engaged employee workforce, access to untapped talent, the social impacts, and as our industry likes to talk about, the long-term cost savings as a result of all of these actual benefits. I think what's most interesting to talk about, though, is that it's not just a theoretical conversation around inclusion. We're actually seeing a lot of great examples, and these are just a couple of them, that involve mainstream businesses and smaller. We had a question a little earlier about that I think was asking about specialists in the impact sourcing sector. And I think it's really important to see that there are a multitude of ways to partner with your suppliers on this concept. Everything from creating hub and spoke models, not just in the developing world, but also in the United States, leveraging the talent and the interesting demographic dividend that's happening in Africa. And then looking at really unique partnerships. And in the case of the Infosys and Desi Crew example, it was a 3-way partnership where Procter & Gamble came to them and said, we want to understand what impact sourcing is and see how we can leverage it. And there they worked with their large partner, Infosys, and subcontracted to Desi Crew to reach women in very rural parts of India. And then we see companies like Teleperformance who've taken a really big focus on impact sourcing. And this is just about the 2,000 Venezuelan refugees in Colombia, but they're telling us about tens of thousands of impact workers across their offices. So it's a really exciting and practical solution and model. We also discussed that we are currently in the midst of doing an RFI and doing a study, revamping a study that we did in 2014. And some of the early information that we're getting in data is equally exciting. As I mentioned earlier, it's no longer about the global South. We're now seeing the global North represented. It's a positive and a negative. It's basically saying that we can find marginalized communities in every pocket of the world. So in our study, we've got over 20 countries represented. We're also starting to see, since this launch in 2010, more areas of service. There's certainly a lot of BPS voice and non-voice, but we're also starting to see digital and ITS infrastructure, ITS applications. So that's very exciting. And then from the perspective of diversity or diverse supplier diversity, I know we often talk about ownership, but what's happening in the impact sourcing space is there's a large concentration on women. Over 55% of the people that have been reported so far in our study are women. So we're seeing a lot more interesting things coming out of this study, and I'm looking forward to publishing it and getting more engagement afterwards.
Rita, I'm going to throw out a question that I see in here. Is impact sourcing more broad than sourcing from diverse suppliers? And my perception is that yes, it is. It's about outsourcing, and of course, outsourcing often is called sourcing when we're talking about a process. That's a semantic thing, but outsourcing that utilizes talent from underserved populations. And I've seen some really interesting examples of that when we're talking about, military spouses as a population that might be traditionally kind of hard to employ because they're moving around, or, imprisoned or incarcerated women as a population, right? Or, somebody else posted rural prosperity hubs where, there might be a local community that's underserved and has lost a lot of jobs, and these setting up centers there that can tap into that community and offer them opportunities. So it's a bit of a way of thinking about kind of an economic development and outreach to populations that we might not have otherwise reached. Did I capture that well?
Perfect, Amy. That's absolutely perfect. And I think it shows the breadth of marginalized communities and the breadth of geographies that are being addressed. And the fact that it's really about being intentional. So it is definitely broader than supplier diversity.
Thank you. And with that, just talking about a little bit of, some of the examples that we've seen. We talked about some of the diversity examples or the impact sourcing examples on the last slide. I think we've really seen the excuse me, the service providers, kind of come around and say that, net zero is important to my customers, so I need to figure out how to be there. I think there's pressure both from the investment community, we talked about that, but as well as the buy side that starts to, encourage companies like Infosys or Cognizant or Wipro or Tech Mahindra to build these capabilities. So we're seeing a lot of that. There's a number of examples in here that you can reference. Sorry, I'm drinking coffee and it's making me cough now. So
Great. So interesting, to see that all of these parameters have come into play when it comes to supplier selection, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do in this is kind of make a list of all the questions that you should be asking your suppliers in the RFP process as it relates to ESG initiatives as well. Because some of the things, like solutioning and pricing and reference checks are the usual criteria that we have been assessing for many, many years. But now that the ESG landscape is becoming more prevalent, some of the questions that we need to ask do range around environmental, social, and governance criteria as well. So I think one comment that I would make on the slide is that many times we're asked, in fact, that whether this is only an information collection mechanism or are people actually using this for their decision-making process as well. I think on that, I would say we already showed some data around that. A lot of firms we assessed are not currently taking action on it, but we have heard of cases wherein firms are treating this as a deal breaker or maker in some cases as well. So very mature ESG organizations, I would say. But if your goal is to drive ESG initiatives, then definitely selecting your supply base and ensuring it is there across your supply base is a very important factor in that case. So a couple of questions over here. I won't deep dive into the questions that are there. We've already spoken about impact sourcing, for instance. Do you have initiatives that target hiring from marginalized communities? This is something that you can ask in the social aspect. And in the environmental aspect, do you target becoming a net zero company? If yes, by when? And why would we ask the when? Because if we as a firm target becoming a net zero company by say 2030, then our suppliers should be following the same kind of outlook as well. Infosys, for instance, is seeing a lot of, I would say, proposals. We spoke to them recently and they mentioned that they've seen a lot of proposals wherein sustainability is actually now treated as a service level as well. Amy mentioned that initially in the beginning as well, but that this is something that we've actually seen across suppliers, especially for engineering services type of categories. They predict that most of the RFPs that they'll see will add sustainability as a service level metric. So very interesting findings on that front. All right. If we move to the next slide, we wanted to provide certain parameters that you can assess on an ongoing basis when it comes to supplier performance measurement. We've actually spoken to a lot of enterprises across industries, and we try to create the most top level metrics that are being assessed when it comes to your quarterly business reviews with your suppliers. And diversity, sustainability, and fair labor practices. These were the three that are being assessed by a lot of organizations. So diversity, we've spoken a little bit about this. This has been measured since a long time, and it is continuously being measured along the way as well. Supplier diversity as well as workforce diversity. But an interesting one I wanted to point out here was fair labor practices. Again, this goes around our talent discussion as well. Because we're looking at how fair are your labor principles, and how are you managing your workforce grievances, and what is your commitment to ensure good workplace standards and comply with them according to the industry standards that are prevalent. So all of these are being measured. Some firms are measuring it very regularly in their quarterly business reviews, and some of them are measuring it on an annual basis or on a semi-annual basis. But these are all things that suppliers can self-report from their end. So if the suppliers have the right digital and data management processes in place, this is something that they can provide as a regular reporting mechanism to your firm. So this is something that firms can look at an overall level. All right, with that, I'll give it back to Amy, and she's going to tell us, give us a broad level view of all the opportunity areas that sourcing teams need to look at with their supply base.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of wrap this up, and I see we're getting a lot of questions, which is great. We'll try to get to those in a moment. We should have time for at least a couple. But some of the things to think about as you're going into 2022, and I think, based on what we've seen so far, most of your organizations have some kind of ESG or objectives in play. And if you are sourcing, especially in services categories, what should you be thinking about? Somebody just asked us about workforce diversity versus supplier diversity, or traditional supplier diversity. I think this is a tricky one. Diversity, government standards in the US for diversity were all around ownership. And there's good reason for that. And I don't think we want to walk away from those goals. However, we know that in our larger supply base than some of the category examples I gave earlier, those just aren't going to be enough. And looking at workforce diversity among your suppliers, I think, is a good proxy as well. You're not going to use that to, check the box on a government contract, but it is going to drive the right intent and the initiatives that, really the intent behind why you have these objectives. And I think that's just as important at this time, especially as we get better at quantifying and looking at, women in leadership and veteran hiring and things like that. There's a lot of different ways to measure that, and I think that's important. Learn more about impact sourcing. If you're not familiar with it, Rita's got great information. We'll be publishing more on that in the near future, including a list of providers that can provide those kind of services. And right now, when we're talking about a talent shortage, and we're seeing companies add specialty providers to their portfolio, this is a great pool of providers to consider. Also validate that your suppliers are matching your environmental targets for your organization. So if you are, shooting for net zero in 2030, make sure your providers understand that and you're aligning with them on those objectives. Make sure you're tracking your ESG capabilities throughout the supplier selection process, and then also integrating that into your SRM processes. So it's not something that you just look at when you select a supplier. It's something that's part of the partnership on a long-term basis. showcasing your ESG evidence points and moving beyond just the E. So the more that you can be visible, and there's always a little bit of concerns of greenwashing, right, when we're talking about the PR around this, but I think if the intent and the actions behind it are legitimate, you want to bring attention to that. You want to show your other suppliers that, this is what it takes to be a successful partner of our business. And I'm sure I could go on a lot more on this, but I know we want to wrap up and get to some of the Q&A here.
All right, good summary there, Amy. And before we go into the Q&A, just one commercial. If you're interested in seeing how organizations are thinking about 2022, we do have a webinar next week on this very topic, where we're going to introduce the findings from that study for the first time. So you can go to our website and click on the webinar section and register for that. Amy, I wanted to give you 60 seconds to talk about how you help clients.
Yeah, I'll try to do it in fewer than 60 because, I do like to make sure any sourcing people on the phone know, on the line, know who we are and what we do. We do a lot more than just ESG, but that's really integrated into what we do as well. The way that we work with procurement teams is generally through memberships and projects. We are a market intelligence and price benchmarking provider for the outsourced services, technology outsourcing, engineering outsourcing, business process and operations outsourcing, as well as global locations. So we've got great coverage around, your GBS locations, if that's something you're looking at. Talent, we have some offerings around talent as well. But our primary, from a category manager perspective, if these are categories you're sourcing, we have the market intelligence around them to help you make better decisions or help your stakeholders make better decisions. So always happy to talk about what information we have that might be able to help. And again, we asked that offer earlier, if you're looking for more information on diversity or ESG and want to reach out to us, please take us up on that offer, and we're happy to share our information.
All right, fantastic. And if you look in the chat, Kiara has posted the link for next week's webinar on the 2022 key issues. All right, let's go to a couple of questions here. And the first one, Rita, I'm going to go to you. I've heard of several examples of prosperity hubs, and I think you mentioned that earlier, in rural North America. Are there examples of prosperity hubs in underrepresented parts of the urban areas in the US specifically?
Yes, actually, one of the examples that we shared earlier by the work at Intuit is exactly that example of rural prosperity hubs. And we also see this happening with some of the specialist companies, People Shores, Interapt. There are a bunch of companies that are setting themselves up very specifically in smaller towns and developing local talent. Interapt is kind of funny because that was an episode on the Daily Show. So check it out. There's a lot of really innovative, great work that's happening in all locations. In fact, I'm also seeing, I think we think about rural and we think about disconnected, but urban pockets in the United States also have quite a bit of poverty. So we've seen iMerit set up shop in New Orleans. So there's a lot happening.
Yeah, Rita, I think, when you and I first spoke and we talked about impact sourcing, my perception was, hey, it was somebody or someone that wants to do good, give back to their communities. I would say that certainly you've had some definitions that evolved past that, but with regards to what you're going to see next week on the webinar and everything else we're hearing from clients, is this talent shortage is real. And so this is going to move from kind of a nice to have or wishful do-gooding thing to part of your future success in many cases, in terms of how are you going to find these people that do not exist. And so they do exist, but you just have to do a little hunting for them, right, Rita?
Yep.
All right, so another question here, Amy, this is probably for you. Procurement is always under pressure to negotiate a lower TCO than the current baseline cost. What's your experience with ESG requirements and the impact of TCO?
Yeah, so great question. Yes, procurement is always on the hook for, if not savings, then overall cost or reduction, or hopefully value creation as well. I think there's some important points that we've made here today, and one is around the talent shortage. Tune into that webinar next week. I like to encourage that, but also, what we are seeing is that costs and services are going up. And actually working with some smaller suppliers and specialty providers and tapping into new talent markets is one of the tactics that companies are using to mitigate some of those cost increases. Or in the case where, realistically costs are going to go up, it's more about fill rates and, just accessing the talents and being able to provide the resources that you need to, say, the CIO to complete their projects. They're at the point where, cost isn't the issue. It's just the ability to get the resources. So tapping into some of these alternative sources of talent can help with that and really drive business productivity. We've seen in general that impact sourcing costs the same or less, and so it's not we're going to pay extra for this. I think when we look at the sustainability side and some of the things that the providers are doing, there is a lot of cost benefit to moving towards a more carbon neutral environment operating model. So long, there might be some upfront transition costs, but I think long term we'll see this be part of that TCO model, because ultimately the less we need to, the less they need to put in terms of energy, that benefits everyone. So expect that to be in the short term. You'll really have to think about how does this impact TCO. Long term, though, I think we're going to see that make more sense on your TCO model.
Yeah, and Amy, I think, from a macro standpoint, we have seen cost takeout has been one of the key drivers of this industry over the last 3+ decades. But that's changing right now. We can see it in the rates. We can see it in the attrition, the vendor rates coming to buyers. We see it in the attrition rates. We see it in the overall macro talent labor pyramids. But what I will say is that, and you'll see this in the numbers next week, some of this is a good news actually for the outsourcing service provider community, in that there is a movement that says if I can't find the talent, maybe I need to outsource that to somebody else who can go be more creative or take advantage of their scale to go find it in places I couldn't normally do myself as a buyer. And so I think that's going to be a business opportunity that accelerates everything that Rita and Venushi and Amy have been talking about here. So I'll put that as the good news. Whenever there's a talent challenge or talent problem of any kind, there's an opportunity. All right, one more question here, and I'm not sure, I don't know if you guys have a take on, do we have an industry breakdown on the maturity adoption of the ESG? Is there any industries that stand out in being earlier adopters or more robust adopters here?
I will talk a little bit anecdotally, but a little bit from research I've done in the past that I think, I don't know about industry. I would say that sort of region and customer bases have driven that. So a lot of ESG initiatives seem further ahead in Europe-based companies. That's been a priority there for a lot longer. And also, probably more in consumer-facing companies as this has been part of the brand. I mean, look at things that like Starbucks has done, or other companies that have a brand that puts this in as part of their values, right? B2B is a little bit behind compared to some of that.
Okay, great answer. And I think with the economic or talent shortages, this has become a business imperative as well, just from a how do we get it.
Yeah.
All right, we're out of time. I want to thank Amy, Venushi, and Rita. Great topic, great conversation. You can go to our blog or to our website and see a lot more content. And if there's anything that you have a direct question, feel free to reach out to any of us, or on by email or by LinkedIn. And appreciate your time today. Thank you.